True crime documentaries are booming. But what do they tell us about criminal justice? And what do they leave out? I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. It seems every week I'm hearing about a new crime documentary. Serial killers, unsolved mysteries, prison confessions. The genre contains a wide spectrum, and I've programmed my fair share at festivals. I have a soft spot for crazy caper stories like Screwball about baseball players doping, or McMillions on crooks rigging the McDonald's Monopoly game. You can hear both of those filmmaking teams on past episodes, and I appreciate how they bring a sense of humor to covering American greed. But the stories that leave me unsettled are those heavy on bloodshed and short on social context. As those stories are multiplying on streaming platforms, I worry about what we're missing. So I turned to Alex Vitale. He wrote the book The End of Policing. It came out in 2018 and then found a new audience last year with the rising movement to defund the police. I wondered what true crime looks like through his eyes.
We've experienced up until this last year about 25, 30 years of consistent declines in serious and violent crime. And yet the number of real crime stories is exploding.
Alex's book is just over 200 pages and covers a lot of ground. He breaks down how America's police are forced to confront an array of crises that could be better served with different expertise. Areas like mental health, school safety, homelessness, and immigration. He's also looking at the criminalization of drugs and sex work and how they could be treated in more productive ways. I'd recommend the book for any documentary maker or funder or distributor whose work is touching upon crime. Our conversation begins and ends with talking about the media. But in between, we discuss what's happening in the wider movement to defund the police. I want to start on a positive note. So I asked Alex if there are documentaries that he admires for how they explore criminal justice. He began by bringing up a series that you can find on Netflix.
There are some things that have been, I think, helpful in the amplification of this kind of broad critique of the criminal justice system as it's currently constituted. I think one of my favorites is Time, the Kalief Browder Story. One of the things that was really appealing about that, and I did have some small role in that, was that it showed the failures at like every step of the criminal legal system. The police, the prosecutors, the judges, the court system, the jail system just systematically failed him at every step. And I think that, when we're looking at the kind of real crime genre, to me, it's divided up into these kind of two camps. One is getting into the head of a criminal or trying to solve a particular crime. And then there are these others that are really exploring these questions of justice. Is the system producing justice? Did we really do the right thing here? And I recall as a young person watching The Thin Blue Line and being impacted by the style of that, but also beginning to really think about whether or not justice is being done all the time by these institutions.
We're about the same age, and I remember the impact of Thin Blue Line. And I think, perhaps my naivete at that age, the thing that seems so shocking about the Thin Blue Line is, oh my gosh, there was a man who was on death row who was innocent. And at the time, in my mindset, that seemed like, a singular incident. And how good it was that a documentary filmmaker came along and shed light on it and helped him get free. I think now, with 30 years perspective, I don't see it as so singular. There's a whole genre of documentaries about people who are incarcerated who are innocent.
I think also part of what was important about that for me was just the idea that someone could unpack something like this. Like I think I was clear about the idea that there were probably injustices, but the idea that there could be an independent investigation that would shed new light on a subject and that would result in this level of public attention was for me a new idea. I think we grew up in a period where the media was like the major networks and the nightly local news and newspapers. And so this was really obviously there had been documentary filmmaking and things before, but just this idea of an advocacy journalism in this long form that was capable of having these real world impacts.
Let's think for a minute about those films that we describe as the true crime genre, which is really expanding today. I wonder what you think that genre does in helping shape the public perception of policing.
Well, I think the a lot of the true crime dramatizations and investigations are, they're it's understandable why they're popular. They deal often with these life and death issues, this interest we have in like what are the parameters of human capacity. But there, and some of these things have been really meaningful, in-depth explorations of important questions about, the nature of human capacities. But there's also been a lot of, I think, exploitative journalism and kind of, corporate interest in just producing a lot of garbage. I think about like Nancy Grace on headline news, just constantly spewing out one crime story after another. And I think cumulatively, this produces a sense of insecurity that is distinct from reality. We've experienced up until this last year about 25, 30 years of consistent declines in serious and violent crime. And yet the number of real crime stories is exploding. And so when we do surveys of people about their perceptions of threat, they're wildly out of sync with reality. And I think part of this is driven by a, constant flow of these real crime stories that make us think that there are serial killers and homicidal maniacs hiding behind every bush. And look, this has changed the culture too. I mean, the way that children are raised, how we feel about safety in public, I think has been shaped by some of these false perceptions around stranger danger and things like that.
What's the kind of analysis that you would like to see more of out of media?
Well, most violent crime occurs between people who know each other and has been preceded by lots of warning signals. And nothing is really done to prevent these warning signals from turning into some horrific outcome. And instead, there's a focus on these sensational sort of stranger cases, which are actually quite rare. And even in those cases, there were often warning signs that were not taken seriously. So my feeling is that on the true crime genre, we need to try to put things into perspective, but also look at how the kind of punitive approach we have to crime has not been particularly effective at preventing a lot of violence that probably could have been prevented if we had different institutional mechanisms in place.
Since last year, when defund police, became a more popular hashtag, and your book was, freshly discovered by people several years after you had written it, and now you're being pulled into more conversations like this one. Um, I wonder when you have those conversations, uh, and sometimes you're being interviewed for other people's documentaries or story-driven podcasts. What are the things that you find yourself having to explain that maybe you wish you didn't have to explain, or are there things that people are asking you that are missing the point?
So, a lot of this stuff revolves around questions of serious violence. And as a society, we've come to kind of accept uncritically a few ideas about this. One is that, police are what are the sort of only possible institutional response that we could have to violence, that punitive systems of punishment are the appropriate way to respond to violence, and that violence is this like constantly looming threat. And so a lot of what I do is try to disaggregate all that and to try to get us to think a little bit more critically about it, that violence is a lot of different things, that has a lot of different drivers behind it, but that there's a lot we can do to identify those drivers, to act proactively outside of a punitive framework. One of the things we know about young people who commit acts of serious violence is that almost all of them have been the victims of serious violence. At the very least, they've been the witnesses to serious violence in home, in the community, etc. And so contextualizing violence in that way at least opens the door to a conversation around responses that are reparative, preventative, restorative, rather than waiting till the damage is done and Xing someone out by executing them, life in prison, etc.
So, how are we doing? It's 9 months since the Black Lives Matter street protests after George Floyd's killing. There was a lot of talk then about defund the police. Even the Minneapolis City Council had talked about taking real measures in that respect. So, what's the scorecard 9 months later?
So, we have had some concrete victories, primarily in places where some pretty concrete organizing had been going on before this summer. So in places like Los Angeles and Oakland and Austin and Albuquerque, where people had been saying for years, we've turned too much over to the police, the community would like to see other kinds of investments for public safety. In places like that, we've seen resources shifted. We've seen new programmatic interventions like hiring more school counselors and reducing school policing or eliminating school policing, creating non-police mental health crisis teams, investing more in community-based anti-violence initiatives. And my sense is that this is going to continue apace. And there are lots of cities that are going to be having these conversations in the next couple of years. And maybe just as importantly, a real focus on organizing at the neighborhood level to have conversations with people about public safety and what could be done to make them safer than the current system. So we have not changed the national political conversation. We're not going to get much help for this in Washington, I think. But I think at the local level, it is shaking up local politics and is very much an ongoing conversation in a lot of places.
And what are some examples of the effectiveness of local organizing? We've coming out of 2020, we saw this street movement that took place, and I'm very curious how that energy translates into other kind of organizing. We've also just come out of a year where organizing was really driven around voter turnout, and of course all this is taking place against an unprecedented pandemic. So when you see examples of cities where you see some real progress taking place. What have been the keys to making that happen that other cities could learn from?
So I think it has to start at the neighborhood level. It has to start with concrete plans that are framed as public safety interventions. So in Oakland, California, the Black Organizing Project there was witnessing a lot of police violence and misconduct directed towards school children. And so they began to organize among the families that had their kids in the school system to say, what can we do to make these kids safer than just having police patrolling the hallways, which the parents knew was causing their kids to be harassed and sometimes arrested, and in a few horrible cases, brutalized and even killed. And so this involved, building out networks of parents and other interested people in the community and having face-to-face conversations about what could be better. How can we rethink like school counselors? What can we do to support families in crisis, which is often a big predictor of the kind of behavior among young people that gets turned over to police? And this went on over years. They wrote reports, they did investigations, they lobbied city council members, they turned people out to budget hearings. And the protests this summer helped to create more political space for what had already been done on the ground. It helped get things over the hump, so to speak. Interestingly, cities where that history of organizing was not present were much less likely to win concrete gains this past year. So there were big protests and there were demands made, but that base building in the neighborhoods hadn't really happened yet. And so the politicians, weren't getting pressure from their own neighborhoods to rethink these spending priorities.
From an organizing standpoint, does it help to be focused on a specific issue? Like you talk about Oakland really focusing on trying to de-escalate police encounters inside schools, and I wonder if that becomes a more effective way of getting change made than a kind of bigger slogan of defund police that could mean a lot of different things and doesn't necessarily it may help to build a philosophical framework, but doesn't necessarily move legislation along.
Well, I think that's largely true. Now, what we see in some cases, like in Minneapolis and Los Angeles, is the development of a kind of people's budget. So coalitions of neighborhood groups and other interest groups are formed around articulating a new set of overall budget priorities. But the concrete victories tend to flow from very targeted campaigns. We want to get the police out of schools. We want to get the police out of the mental health response business. Or we need an anti-violence intervention that's community-centered and not police-centered. So in St. Louis, there were several years of organizing broadly around the failures of the criminal legal system to produce safety in the Black community and the way that that system was causing a lot of harm. But ultimately, it needed to take the form of demands for more money for cure violence programs in the communities and a specific campaign around closing a jail that was a real source of harm in the community. And both those campaigns became successful, but we don't see this broad transformation of the overall city budget yet.
I've heard you talk on other podcasts that mention that you sometimes wind up consulting with police departments, and I wonder what that looks like in the best case scenarios.
Well, these days in the US, most of the consulting I'm doing is with city council members and occasionally mayors who are trying to figure out how to respond to these demands. So it tends to be someone who's sympathetic and is trying to figure out what is possible given the politics of where they are, the budget constraints, etc. And so for me, what that looks like is trying to familiarize people with different models of what is being done in other places and to try to think through a little bit how to build the political will to do this. Now, outside the U.S., I have had inquiries from criminal legal institutions to talk about this in places where there's a little bit more sympathy to the idea that police are not necessarily the best solution to every social problem under the sun. But police in the United States have been largely unwilling to have this conversation, and I'm certainly not getting any invitations from any formal law enforcement agency to talk about these issues.
I remember you writing about a specific police chief, I'm forgetting from where, who was outspoken in recognizing some of the things that you talk about, that the police are overstretched. They should not be on the front lines of all these different things: homelessness, mental health, schools. Um, and I wonder, if you see that as a growing sentiment within police departments, or if those are pretty isolated cases.
I think there is a trajectory within police leadership of chiefs and commissioners who appreciate the fact that they should not be the lead agency in responding to homelessness and mental health crises and school problems, but they're terrified of the idea that their budget might get cut. So they find themselves in a somewhat untenable position of saying, yes, we need the city to take responsibility for more things, but for God's sakes, don't cut our budget. And so this makes it difficult to work in partnership with them because the reality is that in a lot of these cities, 25, 35, 45% of the local budget is going to the police department. And so it's just not possible to ramp up other kinds of initiatives when a quarter to half of the city budget is going into the police. So that's part of why, I've had conversations with some of these chiefs, but they're certainly not, looking to work with me on figuring out how to reduce their budget.
Right. Going back to thinking about media makers and how they are covering police or covering some of the things that you're talking about uh, in terms of organizers trying to make change. I wonder if you see opportunities for different kinds of coverage or stories that are waiting to be told.
Well, I think we've had this genre of showing the failures of the criminal legal system to produce real justice. So that's important, and we need more of that. I think what's missing are the stories about how we could produce public safety in new ways. What do these civilian outreach teams look like? How do these community nonviolence programs function? We've had a little bit of this around like violence interrupters, but we need a lot more of that. What's happening with these attempts of communities to self-organize themselves, to better utilize the interpersonal relationships and resources that they already have to resolve disputes and manage problems without getting the police involved? And for a lot of people, these seem like very abstract ideas. And if we could have a generation of documentaries on the ground looking at these efforts, that might help concretize these ideas for people.
I mean, even as you say that, I think about filmmakers in pitch meetings, and if they've got, one story that's a true crime story and another story that's about, organizers trying to achieve better mental health outcomes, you can just imagine which story is going to get picked up more quickly. And so I wonder, in the stories that you speak of liking to see more of, if you see ways of telling those stories that can make them as compelling as the true crime suspenseful narrative.
Well, there is human drama here, right? Because we are talking about communities that are struggling, where people are having real crises, and where lives are lost sometimes. Lost to suicides, lost to overdoses, lost to interpersonal violence, lost to police violence. And these communities are struggling for ways to improve those situations. So I think it's possible to interweave a narrative about the life and death struggles of these communities with a conversation about, empowerment and moving forward. Because these are going to be mostly positive stories that we are capable of making improvements in these dynamics. And all of this is in the context of this powerful demand for more stories about racial justice. And of course, that's a signal feature of this conversation, right? There's a reason why certain communities have been left to make these struggles and others haven't. And the legacy of racial discrimination is a big part of that conversation.
Well, I think what you're saying also points to who traditionally has been empowered and funded to tell these stories, and the which communities are included and excluded from those ability to tell stories.
Yeah, we should look at what have the dynamics been of getting projects greenlit that do really take on these questions of racial justice? And often it's not through traditional media networks. It's through the largesse of Black celebrities. Someone like Jay-Z stepping in with his own private capital to make these projects happen.
Which was the case, I think, with the Kalief Browder film that you were talking about.
That's right.
Yeah. Has anyone approached you about adapting your book into a documentary?
So I'm working with a team that's been trying to figure this out. We've been looking at some of these on-the-ground efforts to produce alternatives to policing, looking at the actual dynamics of organizing and building political power at the neighborhood level to decriminalize sex work, or to create harm reduction interventions for drugs, or to create police-free schools. And so it's not exactly like a retelling of the book, but it's making a film that takes the lessons of the book to heart and looks to see how it could be implemented.
I want to thank Alex Vitale for speaking with me. His book, The End of Policing, is published by Verso. While we're on this subject, I want to recommend another podcast, the 6-part series, Running from Cops. The host, Dan Taberski, conducts a deep investigation into the longest-running reality TV show in history, Cops. He interviews producers of the show and also people who were arrested on camera. He explores how the TV crews wound up distorting reality more than representing it. Again, the show is called Running from Cops. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphaela Nahausen. I'm Thom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOM Powers. You can read our show notes and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.